Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 88. Today, we're doing a little bit of an experiment. For the most part, I try to keep to a very disciplined editing approach on the length of our episodes, and generally I try to keep them to around 30 minutes, plus or minus. Occasionally, though, and more particularly where outside testimony is involved, I have found that difficult. In fact, episode 87 was the longest yet, at over an hour in length. So I do apologize for that, as it was a long one to listen to with Floyd Reeby, and me, and Jeremy Gunn, all three of us, talking a lot. Today, we're going to try something a little different when it comes to formatted length. This episode's material is well suited for the experiment. So, if episode 87 was the alpha, then today's episode 88 is the omega when it comes to the length of an episode. This will be the shortest episode I've done, and it's simply to finish up with Floyd Reeby. And since we are trying out this new format, I would love to hear from you again, or perhaps even just the first time. And you can do that by emailing me at podcastjfk@gmail.com. That's podcastjfk@gmail.com. If you like this format for an episode, we'll do more of the shorter ones and less of the longer ones. Well, if we can. Most of us have had our fill with him already, but there was something that I hinted at in a part of episode 87, and with 87 already at 1 hour plus, there just didn't seem to be enough time to finish up with this little piece, this last little piece. And so what was it that Reeby said? What was the little bit of testimony left that needed to be brought out? Well, that takeaway is that in David Lifton's original interviews with Reeby, he was adamant that the entire rear and lower part of the head in the occipital region was blown out. But now, fast forward to Reeby's ARRB testimony, and at the end of the day, he substantially changed his view from what you heard in earlier episodes. And it was quite evident toward the end of his testimony when he was in front of the ARRB lawyers. In the last couple of questions that Jeremy Gunn would ask him, well, rather disappointingly, you would hear from Reeby an acknowledgement that some of the photographs clearly now showed a hole higher up in the head than what he had originally seen. Except, the exchange began to show the cracks in his memory, or truly just the transition to a new narrative, when he now said, and that the head one was higher, and then, finally, he would make the most astounding comment of his sworn testimony, when he would view the famous intact photo of the back of the president's head, and he would agree the president's scalp was intact all the way down to the hairline. That was the way he now remembered it. Well, that was a far cry from his previous statements in the 1970s made to Lifton when he was very clear that the rear of the head was completely blown out. You heard those statements in a previous episode when the ARRB lawyers played the tape when interrogating John Stringer. So, what happened to this witness? Why would there be such a huge pivot? The idea of best evidence that we have come to know so well on this journey, the concept of best evidence will always tell you that the earlier testimony is the better testimony, unless there is some extenuating circumstance. And certainly in the case of the Kennedy assassination, there were many. The threats, the concerns that people had, the secrecy orders that were in place related to the autopsy. There were so many factors, and the pressures associated with them could have come into play at various times for various witnesses. There is no doubt that Reeby's about-face is one of the most quizzical elements of all the ARRB testimony that was taken. Had it not been for the incredible effort of David Lifton in those early years, and then the recording of Reeby's words on tape, well, you never would have believed that there was an eyewitness who saw something terribly different there. You know, if that would have happened, there would have been no controversy here at all. You would be doing something different this morning besides listening to this last episode on Reeby. But instead, there was the ghost of the assassination, figuratively the ghost of another Rosetta Stone associated with the case, and right there in the room that day. Like I have said before, in so many ways, on so many occasions, life is a complicated thing. And this whole affair, the assassination of the President of the United States, well, it's easy for us, some 60 years or so later, to scrutinize it in the scientific way that we are trying to do so, and to try and do it so dispassionately, and that comes without much consideration of any of the pressures which any of these witnesses might have been under. In one way, it allows us to see things much more clearly without the so-called fog of war and without the fear of the moment that came with this whole circumstance as it happened and during its aftermath, as it was being formally investigated. On the other hand, there is a certain naivete in that approach. Prosecutors know this. Defense attorneys know this. Investigators know this. Because in life, nothing happens in a vacuum, and so many things are intertwined with so many other things, making the truth complicated and, at times, very elusive. Ah, the web that is weaved, right? Sound familiar to you and the things that you observe in the world today? And of course, the web that was weaved here in the Kennedy assassination comes from that same dynamic of life. But in this case, one that was, well, let's say, one with more far-reaching tentacles, one with more complicated and fantastic implications, one with infinitely greater fear associated with it, all of which have a curious impact on the human condition and the way human beings engage as players in it. Simply put, some witnesses stand up and into the fray and are a beacon of courage and clarity, and others crouch down or walk away quietly, hoping never to be seen or identified so that they will never have to be heard from, or, once found, just willing to say only things that keep them from danger. Still, others see it as a curious elixir for things in life that were never there before and may never be there again, and their chance for the 5 minutes upon the stage to strut and fret, despite the fact that it's like having a peep show present at a funeral. Distasteful and distracting. Well, I'll leave it to you as a juror to figure out what's going on here. Well, that small wander is over, so let's listen to these final few comments made by Reby. Oh, and one more thing. Unfortunately, the last most important audio clip that you will hear from Reby today has a technical defect. It has been sped up somehow, and it sounds a little like, well, you know, Donald Duck talking. You know that sound. But don't let that fool you. It's the most serious and the most important exchange among the clips that you will hear today. So listen carefully. That is, listen carefully to the words and not the silly tone of it that is attributable to the technical defect. And then, let's get on to more episodes. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 88 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
Do you see any significant injuries to the left side of President Kennedy's head?
No.
And does that correspond reasonably closely with your own recollection?
Yes.
Okay. We then go to the second view, which has been described as the right side of head and right shoulder. Black and white images numbers 5 and 6, color numbers 26, 27, and 28. Mr. Reby, are you able to see those images that I just described reasonably closely now?
Yeah.
Do those images correspond, at least in a general way, with what you observed at the autopsy of President Kennedy on November 22nd?
Yes.
Is there anything that you see in those images that appears to be different from what you recall that night?
Well, the wound is placed differently. It could be just that the wound is more on the top side of the head, not in the back.
When you say the wound, you're referring to the wound as it appears in the photograph,
yes,
is in a location somewhat different from what you recollected from memory?
It could be. It just, yeah. My recollection could have been off too from whatever that night. That looks about right.
Now, could you look at the back of President Kennedy's head in the occipital region? You previously used the term occipital, is that right?
Yes. That's one piece.
Does that correspond with what you observed on the night of November 22nd?
Yeah.
So that where it appears, at least to me, as if there is hair and scalp covering the occipital area, that does not differ from what you saw on November 22nd?
I don't think so, no.
So it seems to be a reasonably accurate description?
Yeah.
Okay, coming next, please.
Thank you for listening to episode 88 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK, The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 89. It's the story of an intensely studied but not so well-known element of the forensic review related to the damage to the president's head and what it meant for determining just where the shots came from that day. It's the story of the Harper fragment. But let's back up for a moment and remember just how terrifically macabre the entire scene was at the moment that the president was shot. It truly was one of the most horrific scenes in our history, and within it was a moment caught on the Zapruder film that is emblematic of the trauma. A moment that is hard to erase from one's mind once you've seen it. It involves those few seconds within the Zapruder film that occurred just after the shots hit the president, and Clint Hill began to race to the limousine. And just when Jacqueline Kennedy herself crawled up and backwards onto the trunk of the presidential limousine, attempting to retrieve the president's brain, because it had been scattered into pieces in that now sacred part of Dealey Plaza. I can't imagine the trauma of that moment, but crawling up on that trunk to find her, well, hopeless act of mercy and courage in the face of such evil. She crawled up on the back of that limousine top, chasing a portion of the president's head, as if she could put her husband back together again. There was plenty more of the president's skull that was so violently dislodged as a result of such a violent shooting. Plenty enough that even after Jacqueline Kennedy clutched a piece of it that had traversed only as far as the back of the limousine, well, there were still 4 more fragments that would be retrieved and play a part in the forensic review or the subsequent analysis of the forensics. The piece of the skull that Jacqueline Kennedy would hold on to for the remainder of the ride to Parkland was the biggest of all. It would eventually be named the Delta fragment. Its presence was clearly discernible on the Zapruder tape as Mrs. Kennedy reached out for it and Clint Hill nudged it back into her hand as it skidded backward and as he was lunging forward onto the limousine. The shot was so violent and so explosive that it was like detonating a bomb inside the president's head. You heard in previous episodes that he suffered multiple fractures, and during the X-ray procedures, as Gerald Custer handled his head, the fractures felt like a hard-boiled egg that had been rolled in your hand. The fractures were abundant and almost everywhere. But these bone fragments were a result of the physics that are necessary when such a powerful shot makes its way inside the head. The wave of energy is absorbed and transferred, and its concentration eventually bursts a hole and ejects the fragments. This violent process happens so quickly and with such force that some theories surmise that these fragments can pierce the thin membrane that surrounds the skull and the skin and the scalp too, leaving in some cases the skin of the scalp intact, with only a tear from the exit. As a layperson, that is hard to believe, but apparently that is so, and apparently that is at least a part of the explanation as to why part of the skull and brain are missing, and yet the related parts of the skin and scalp appear to be somewhat left intact. More on that later. So this violent energy of the shot meant that more than one fragment would eject from the president's body that day. There were 2 other smaller fragments that hurled off into the front area of the limousine. They were retrieved by the Secret Service as the car was inspected and flown to Bethesda late on the night of the assassination. In addition to those 2 fragments that were used in the actual autopsy proceeding on Friday night, and then on Saturday, there were 2 other fragments still to be found right there in Dealey Plaza. And the story of the largest of those 2 fragments is the story that you'll hear today, the piece of the president's skull bone that has now come to be known as the Harper fragment. In addition to the Harper fragment, there was a second fragment retrieved in Dealey Plaza, but we won't touch upon that until we finish with the Harper fragment first. The Harper fragment is one of the most studied elements of the forensic examination of the president's head wounds. There are reams of information about it, and some of it very highly technical, and some just highly theoretical. To this day, there are no definitive answers to the most basic question surrounding the fragment itself, and that is, what part of the brain did this fragment actually come from? And why is the answer to that question so important? Well, answering that question could put to bed the basic question of whether there was a gaping hole in the occipital region of the back of the president's head, or not. And remember our simple truth and axiom about the direction from which the shots came from. If there was a hole, a blowout hole in the occipital region, well, experts tell us that it must have been caused by a shot coming from somewhere other than the rear and above, and thus a second shooter involved. So, in some ways, with all of the bungled elements of the autopsy and all the suspicion around missing, altered, or even faked autopsy evidence, here was a piece of forensic autopsy evidence that might tell the story all by its lonesome. A Rosetta Stone, so to speak, when reconstructing the skull parts and the conclusions of the autopsy itself. And this story of this fragment is, in and of itself, well, seemingly written like it was full of elements from a Dan Brown novel. Just like so many other parts of the story of the JFK assassination, you know, as I keep saying to you, you really can't make this stuff up. As you know, I like to joke around and say sometimes that I'm not a lawyer, but I sometimes play one on TV. Well, I'm not a forensic pathologist either, but sometimes I do try to play one on this podcast. Okay, in all seriousness though, I can't do justice to all of the technical analysis that's been done on the Harper fragment, but I can make an attempt to bring to life the basic story of the fragment and the way it ultimately fit into the investigation and some of the work that was done afterward to better understand whether this piece of skull bone was really the Rosetta Stone that would determine the direction of one or more of the shots or not. And that is the objective of these episodes on the Harper fragment. But this is one of the most studied pieces of evidence by assassination researchers and certainly doctors and other scientists. So we would be remiss if we didn't mention some of those expert views of what the Harper fragment really means to the conclusions about a shooter conspiracy. So we'll do that too as we wander through the story of the Harper fragment. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 89 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Dealey Plaza was anything but the modern crime scene that you and I are used to. You know, even after any serious crime in the times that we now live in today, there would be a cordoning off of the area. You know, yellow tape encircling where the crime scene occurred, and there wouldn't be hundreds of people tromping all through the area and surely compromising the evidence, no matter what good intentions they might have had. Now, we have to remember it was 1963 and there was no yellow tape, and quite frankly, on Saturday, November 23rd, the world's emotions surrounding the event itself were still running incredibly high. and Dealey Plaza was full of curious onlookers who wanted to see and experience the actual place where this horrific event occurred. And of course, certainly there were those that were in Dealey Plaza just trying to pay some level of respect to the fallen president and his family, and still others were trying to gain real knowledge about what actually did happen and make sense of it all. And so it was around 5:30 p.m. on that Saturday, November 23rd, 1963, when William Allen Harper, who was a college student there in Dallas, actually a pre-med student, made his way to the plaza. He was in the middle of taking photographs, and he found a small object which appeared to be a bone fragment. What could it be? Well, young Bill Harper picked up the fragment and took it to his uncle, Dr. Jack Harper, who worked at Methodist Hospital there in Dallas. After reviewing the bone fragment, Dr. Jack Harper on Monday, November 25th, would call the FBI and speak with FBI agent James Anderton. So it's important to pause here and remind the listener that the authorities were not made aware of this very large fragment of human skull until Monday after the weekend's events had occurred related to the president's autopsy, but perhaps known about before at least some of the supplemental forensic work took place on the president's brain. And the existence of this fragment was certainly known about before the supplemental review was fully completed and documented. David Lifton, in his celebrated book Best Evidence, gives a good account of what took place behind the scenes related to the Harper fragment, although this information wasn't revealed until the FBI released many documents in 1978. When FBI agent Anderton notified the Secret Service of the existence of this fragment, he was immediately instructed by Robert Bauch that the bone fragment should be sent to the White House, and I quote, "no publicity whatsoever," end quote. Robert Bauch was the then chief of the Protected Research Section of the Secret Service in Washington. Anderton wrote that comment in a November 25, 1963 field office memo. Meanwhile, FBI Assistant Director Alan Belmont had a different idea on how the bone fragment should be handled. Belmont called the Dallas FBI office and instructed that the bone fragment instead be sent directly to the FBI lab in Washington. FBI lab sheets indicate that when the bone reached Washington, the lab x-rayed the fragment and found no metal, but did find traces of human blood, a notation that was made in the FBI records at the time. No report to be made. In Dallas, Agent Anderton wrote that Dr. Berkeley had passed the word through the Secret Service that the fragment should be delivered to the White House so that, in the event this bone fragment came from President Kennedy's head, it can be included in the autopsy reports. But the bone was not given to the autopsy doctors, nor was any mention of it made in the autopsy, although another aspect of the autopsy was still to be done, that is, the brain. By then, the brain had been fixed in formaldehyde. Refer back to our earlier episodes on the timing of the supplemental brain exam. The matter might have ended right there had it not been for facts known to the FBI. In Dallas, Dr. Jack Harper had Dr. A.B. Cairns, who was the chief pathologist at Methodist Hospital there in Dallas. Well, each of them examined the specimen, and both men concluded that it was probably part of the occipital bone. Next, the fragment was shown to a third Dallas physician, Dr. Gerhard Noteboom, who reaffirmed that he too believed it was part of the occipital bone. Before the fragment was turned over to the authorities, it was photographed by Wayne Bulletier, who was the chief medical photographer at Methodist Hospital. It is believed that he made 12 photographs of the fragment before it was returned to the FBI. In June 1964, Attorney General Robert Kennedy received a letter from a woman in Hayward, California, who wrote that she hoped the Attorney General would someday run for president. She added almost in passing that in Dallas she had seen snapshots taken at a hospital of pieces of his brother's head. Robert Kennedy forwarded the letter to the Warren Commission, and it made its way to Chief Counsel Lee Rankin. Rankin's second-in-command on the staff was Howard Willans, and Willans immediately requested an FBI investigation. Now, the FBI learned for the first time that pictures of the bone had been taken in Dallas. Moreover, the Dr. Cairn had an opinion about the anatomic origin of this bone fragment. The FBI report of a formal interview with Dr. Cairn in July 1964 states the following. Dr. Cairn advised that he and Dr. Harper examined the bone, and that Dr. Cairn stated that the one specimen looked like it came from the occipital region of the skull. He said he evaluated it purely from its gross appearance. David Lifton's initial reaction to this information in 1972 was simple and straightforward. If this piece of the skull had come from the occipital region, then there would be no more debate as to whether it was a gaping hole within that part of the skull. And more importantly, it might also signify that certain autopsy photographs and certain autopsy x-rays were clearly fakes as well. The bone itself is trapezoidal in shape, and when you apply a ruler to the existing photographs, it measures approximately 7 by 5.5 centimeters. Paul Eaton, a JFK assassination researcher, participated in a talk show in Palm Springs, California on November 22, 1992, the 29th anniversary of the assassination. And during that talk show, he interviewed Dr. Gerhard Noteboom on the program. Dr. Noteboom reaffirmed the narrative that all three pathologists at Methodist Hospital examined the Harper fragment and thought it was occipital bone. Dr. Noteboom also noted that there were lead fragments on the Harper fragment. So where did the bone fragment go from here? Surely the fragment was turned over to the pathologists, Humes and Boswell, right? Shouldn't the two men in charge of the president's autopsy take possession of this fragment and perform an examination of it? Shouldn't such a fragment be an integral part of solving the puzzle, no matter what such examination indicated? Well, neither Humes nor Boswell, during the course of the one and only autopsy, ever saw the fragment. And they did not have it during their post-autopsy supplemental examination of the brain. Why not? Was it prima facie evidence that Dr. Berkeley did not want to be further reviewed? Was it due to the Kennedy family wishes that enough was enough? What could possibly justify holding that fragment and refraining from further analysis at that very moment? Moreover, the Harper fragment was never seen again. Where did it go? And again, why was it being hidden? 6 decades later, we do not know the answer to that, and honestly, the identification of this bone fragment and the determination of what specific spot it emanated from is still a matter of great debate today. Anyone with a medical background and a cover-up in mind would realize that the answer to this question was so complex that releasing it to the autopsy doctors or to the general public was unlikely to produce a definitive answer. It's ironic that the decision to conceal it only added to the suspicion years later that some sort of a medical conspiracy had occurred that day at Bethesda. What is even more suspicious is that the Harper fragment has never been seen since. It just went missing as soon as it got into the hands of Dr. Berkeley and then passed to the FBI. Strange, you say? Well, what was preserved was some very good photographs, and while photographs are no substitute for being close up or holding that fragment in your own hands, those photos are as good as it's ever going to get at this point. Oh, wait a minute. And wouldn't you know it, even the Zapruder film plays into it here. You see, not only can you see in clarity the Delta fragment and the famous story around it that we just told, but the ejection of both the Harper fragment and the Weitzman fragment were also captured by Zapruder's masterful camera work. The Harper fragment ejection can also be seen in the Nix film, but it's not as clear as what can be seen in the Zapruder film. The Zapruder film, right at around frame Z312 or 313, visualizes what some experts, including David Mantik, agree is the path taken by the Harper fragment as it ejected out of the president's brain and then traveled like a soccer ball, finally landing on the south side of the plaza, about 25 feet to the president's left, which is south, and slightly forward of the car. Remember that term, slightly forward of the car. There it was violently ejected at first, but lying now gently in the grass. Billy Harper, the young man for which the fragment was named, would later revisit the assassination site and reconfirm the approximate spot where he retrieved the fragment. That's an important point to know because there was plenty of controversy around the exact landing spot of that fragment and what it meant to the determination of where that fragment came from. It should be noted that Harper's identification of the spot where he retrieved the fragment is entirely consistent with the trajectory and travel of the fragment as shown in the Zapruder film. How could the fragment have been ejected forward and to the left when it was a piece of bone coming from the right rear? A good question to ask, don't you think? And that is one of the very important questions to ask if you believe this bone was a piece of occipital bone. By the way, before we answer that one, the Weitzman fragment was found on the south side of the curb on Elm Street, which was closer to the limousine and also farther to the rear, and it can also be seen on the Zapruder film. The Weitzman fragment is smaller than the Harper fragment, and it was identified shortly after the assassination and was flown to Washington and used in the autopsy proceedings that night. The actions taken first by Dr. Berkeley and then the steps taken by the FBI virtually assured that this critical piece of evidence would not be critically reviewed by the Warren Commission. Yes, it was mentioned in a few FBI reports, but there was nothing about this fragment that would support the theory of the lone gunman. So, in the FBI's eyes and the Warren Commission's eyes, this was perhaps just another piece of evidence where they would just let sleeping dogs lie. Little was known about the Harper fragment for years, until the 1967 study of the assassination and the Warren Commission report by CBS. CBS convened the iTech Corporation, which, at the time, had some notoriety as a high-tech company that, ironically, had ties to the CIA, including the manufacture of certain high-end technologies contained in the U-2 spy plane. iTech was tasked in various engagements with various technical reviews related to both the photographic and video materials associated with the assassination, mostly with very specific testing objectives. As CBS began to put together their news special, they reconvened iTech to review the Zapruder film and, more specifically, to review the frames which showed actual ejection of brain matter. This particular review was for the purposes of establishing the direction of the spray of the brain matter as part of the process to forensically identify the direction from which the shots were taken. In other words, to verify or wreak havoc on the lone gunman theory. As I said, the study was part of a nationally televised special on the assassination, and it certainly did bring light to the Harper fragment. Like so much in the study of the assassination, the Harper fragment would again take a low profile for the next few years. But fast forward to the work being done in the late 1970s by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and there you can find the next attempt to explore more deeply where the Harper fragment actually came from. Unfortunately, the House Select Committee on Assassinations conducted a process that seemingly resulted in no real conclusions regarding the origin of this skull fragment. In fact, one could argue that all they did was to bring more confusion and uncertainty around where this bone fragment should be placed in the reconstruction. The HSCA medical panel still had no exhibit to examine. That is, no actual Harper bone fragment to look at. So the next best thing would be to review the photographs. And that is what they did. Keep in mind that the HSCA, at least in the early going, was reasonably well funded and deployed a fair number of investigators and outside experts to examine materials and do further investigation beyond what the FBI and the Warren Commission had done in 1964. As you know, Dr. Michael Bodden was the head of the HSCA medical panel. With good intentions, they brought in an anthropologist, J. Lawrence Angel, who was a Ph.D. on loan from his curator position at the Smithsonian Institute. Dr. Angel, whose sole purpose was to review the fragment without bias, without prior knowledge or conclusions made by the Dallas doctors at Methodist Hospital, or observations already made by the HSCA panel itself, He was there to independently determine whether the bone was from the occipital area of the skull or whether it was from the parietal area or some other area, and continue to keep in mind that the possibility of these two different areas also meant the possibility of two different conclusions on the direction from which the shots came. The exchange between Dr. Angel and the HSCA medical panel was interesting. I'll share some of the thoughts on this exchange as they were captured in David Lifton's Best Evidence and excerpted from some of the testimony that was taken that day. Here we go. Dr. J. Lawrence Angel, curator of physical anthropology at the Smithsonian, arrived at the meeting of the HSCA medical panel. Dr. Charles Petty, the chief medical examiner of Dallas, Texas, and a member of the panel, said he would like very much to have Angel's expertise in identifying this particular fragment and determining what part of the head it came from. Dr. Angel's response was, well, it's clearly parietal bone. Side left or right, it's not so easy. As evidence for this assertion, Dr. Angel said, you can see one or two or three markings for meningeal vessels on the inner surface. Based on that, he said the bone could fit into the huge hole, around here. Around where? Asked Dr. Petty. Well, Dr. Angel tried to describe the location, and he qualified his opinion at first, saying, I could see marks of sagittal suture here, but I don't think that's it. And then Dr. Angel discovered that what he had been calling a suture line wasn't a suture line at all. Suture lines go completely through the bone. But Dr. Angel couldn't find a corresponding line on the photograph of the interior surface of the Harper fragment. Well, excuse me, he would say, it doesn't seem to show in the inside. I'm puzzled, he would say. Dr. Angel turned to the others. Are you sure that's suture edge there? They were of little help. Dr. Boswell replied, we're not sure. We ask for your advice. Then Dr. Davis, also present and on the medical panel, said, that's why you're here, sir. Dr. Angel then explained why his original idea was wrong. He said, I thought these, referring to the grooves visible on the interior surface, I thought these were intermediate posterior branches of middle meningeal going up the side of the parietal. Here he would add, I would have looked here for a trace of lambdoid suture. The lambdoid suture is an inverted V-shaped suture that marks the border of the occipital bone at the back of the head, the border with the left and the right parietal bones. If the Harper bone had contained lambdoid suture, it would be part occipital and part parietal, depending upon where the suture line was. Then Dr. Angel remarked, but of course, I don't know what damage the skull showed and whether this has to be, but I'm not supposed to know this. That was the essence of the matter. Dr. Angel's identification should have been based on anthropological evidence alone, not a knowledge of where the bone was supposed to fit. The committee proceeded on a different basis from that point on. After that, Dr. Biden said, no, Dr. Angel, feel free to discuss this with Dr. Humes, who did the autopsy. He'd be delighted to engage with you. Well, Angel asked if there was a defect on the right that this would fit into, and Humes then replied, as if rewarding a good student bright enough to ask the proper question, Dr. Angel, yes. Well, Dr. Humes then asked that the x-rays showing the large skull hole be put up on the screen for Dr. Angel's benefit. Now, the doctor suggested that the Harper fragment be moved toward the extreme forward part of the parietal bone where the coronal suture marks the border with the frontal bone. Could that be corona suture? Asked Dr. Petty. Replied Angel, I would have guessed that it might be. Again, I don't see any meningeal vessel markings, but that's conceivable. Dr. Angel now apparently realized that the x-rays showed that the hole actually extended into the frontal bone. Now there was damage that far forward, and he saw it as he was viewing the lateral x-ray. He commented, yes, that's right. That was his immediate reaction. Well, this then could be frontal perfectly well. It does show the meningeal markings, and that's what made me unhappy about it to begin with. Well, the photo makes more sense now. Okay, by this point, Dr. Angel had considered 2 distinct locations for the Harper fragment. After some discussion, Angel now came up with a 3rd place for the Harper fragment, somewhere on the top of the head in the parietal area. And that's when Dr. Petty asked whether the Harper piece could be fitted posterior and slightly lateral. Is that what you're saying? He replied, this is what I'm saying, yes. And Angel replied, that is what I'm saying, yes. And perhaps a bit later he commented, it's hard to do that jigsaw puzzle. And that's all I can say. Dr. Petty admitted, well, it's terribly fragmented and we really can't reconstruct it. Indeed, Dr. Petty seemed willing at this point to settle for less. He would say, our ultimate question is, do you think this would well be part of the skull of the late president's head? Referring now to the Harper piece, of course. Angel replied, yes. The record indicated then that the Harper fragment was moved around on the head by Dr. Angel and members of the panel trying to find a place for it within the hole that Dr. Angel indicated, so it might show lambdoid suture, sagittal suture, and corona suture corresponding roughly to the right rear, the middle at the top, and then the forward part of the head. Take your pick. A month later, on October 24th, 1977, Dr. Angel submitted his report. In it, he described the perimeter of the whole scene on the photographs in order to approximate the position of the fragment. He wrote, it's necessary to do this to define the gap, a sentence making the jigsaw method explicit, and then he drew 3 more sketches labeling the top view, deduced, not observed, from the Harper fragment photographs. He wrote that this photograph shows it as coming mainly from the upper middle third of the right parietal bone. Dr. Angel's report is noteworthy for the lack of any specific anthropological evidence uniquely identifying the bone. His memo states vascular foramina on the inside and a faint, irregular line on the outside indicative of sagittal suture. But the transcript a month earlier shows he said, at first I could see marks of sagittal suture here, but I don't think that's it. Concluding his report, Dr. Angel attempted to relate the borders of the Harper fragment to the borders of the wound, the margin shown in the autopsy pictures, borders which Dr. Hume said showed no relationship at all, using language such as one section appears to fit another, it can fit, and in a third reference in Dr. Angel's report, he said, may meet. This leaves the following question for history to decide. Whose identification of the Harper fragment is more reliable? That of A.B. Cairns, who actually held the bone in his hand and examined it and said it was occipital bone, an opinion concurred to by the 2 other doctors who also saw the bone in person? Or the memorandum of Dr. Angel. Ever since A.B. Cairns uttered that original conclusion, that is, in his opinion, the bone specimen looked like it came from the occipital region of the skull, well, conspiracy books ever since have quoted Cairns and used his assessment as evidence of a frontal shot exiting the rear of the head. Author Josiah Thompson in 6 Seconds in Dallas, after citing Cairns, notes that it is difficult to understand how a shot from the rear could drive a piece of the occipital bone 25 feet to the left of the vehicle's path. It is not so difficult to understand how a shot from the right front, exploding through the rear of the skull, could produce precisely that effect. But again, suppose Cairns was wrong here. The Warren Commission failed to deal with this issue at all. However, by 1977, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations began its work, the existence of the bone and its possible importance were well known. The committee's forensic pathology panel studied photos of the fragment made at Methodist Hospital, and you can see it included as Warren Commission Document 1395. The committee attempted reconstruction of the skull fractures using paper cutouts that were prepared to approximate the shape and the size of the bone fragments, demonstrated in X-rays numbers 4, 5, and 6, and a photograph of the Harper bone fragment. The panel attempted to locate the correct position of these fragments and then, using the paper cutouts, to place these bone fragments on a human skull for the purposes of reconstruction. All of this was done before the conversation they had with Dr. Angel. The largest of the X-ray fragments, which showed outer beveling and tiny metal fragments, are evident, according to that reconstruction. According to that reconstruction, it completes a portion of the exit perforation within the suture line fitting into the coronal suture. The Harper bone fragment completes the circular perforation in the suture line immediately superior to the temporal bone. No other exit or entrance perforation is identified. That was the committee's position on this. What was the committee's rationale when they documented this in their final report? Well, it went something like this. Immediately superior to the temporal bone is parietal bone, not occipital bone. Further, since the autopsy photos and x-rays showed occipital bone intact, although replete with fractures, at the time of the Bethesda autopsy, it was obvious that the Harper fragment could not be occipital bone. Well, there you have it. They again went back and blessed the authenticity of the x-rays, and then because the x-rays had to be authentic and there was no gap in the occipital area, this could not possibly be occipital bone. They're probably right if the x-rays are authentic. Again, this whole review and exchange had to be conducted based on photographs of the Harper fragment because the original had never been retrieved after going into the black hole of the FBI. And on the topic of the missing piece of evidence itself, HSCA staff investigator Andrew Purdy wrote a memo to the file related to the Harper fragment. It's buried in Appendix 10 of the House Select Committee's final report. It's worth reading here for you, and so I'll quote it now. It's a memorandum to the file from Andrew Purdy dated August 17, 1977, with the subject being the search for the missing autopsy materials. I spoke with Dr. Jack Harper on August 8th by phone. Dr. Harper is the uncle of the pre-medical student who found the fragment in Dealey Plaza. Dr. Harper presumes the skull fragment is now with the other skull fragments and said that his nephew gave it to the FBI. Dr. Harper saw the fragment on the Sunday following the assassination and took it to the Methodist Hospital on Monday, at which time he contacted the FBI. Dr. Harper said the consensus of the doctors who reviewed the skull fragment was that it was part of the occipital region. Dr. Harper said he retained a photo of the skull fragment for about a year, at which time the FBI took it from him. He says that he believes his nephew still has such a photograph. Dr. Harper said the skull fragment had relatively fresh blood on it. I spoke with Dr. A.B. Cairns on August 9, 1977, regarding the Harper skull fragment. Dr. Cairns has retired from his position as Chief of Pathology at Methodist Hospital. I spoke with Dr. Cairns once by telephone regarding his recollections of examining the skull fragment. Dr. Cairns said that the piece of skull fragment came from an area approximately 2.5 to 3 inches above the spine area. He said it had the markings of a piece of skull fragment from the lower occipital area, specifically containing suture and inner markings where blood vessels run around the base of the skull. Dr. Cairns remembered a small area of the skull fragment showing grayish discoloration, suggesting metallic stain on the bone. He said he had had experience with gunshot damage in the past which looked similar to this discoloration. Dr. Cairns said he could see blood markings which indicated the skull fragment had been dislodged recently. Dr. Cairns stated that he wasn't very interested in the skull fragment, but did believe it was part of the assassination. Dr. Cairns said that the skull fragment had no indication of being an entry or an exit wound. He said, in other words, that the edges of the wound did not show. However, he said he believed the skull fragment came from an area close to the entry wound by virtue of the way the tables were broken. Dr. Cairns said that he was interviewed by an FBI agent from Oklahoma City with a Spanish surname. This memo ends here with seemingly no additional explanation of the FBI interview, the one that took place with the FBI agent who had a Spanish surname. It does seem like an odd place to end the memo. But nevertheless, even what is in this FBI memo is telling. There were other skilled researchers and medical professionals with other views of this. We can't go into all of them, but let's address one of them here. Dr. Joseph Riley was a neuroanatomist and conspiracy-oriented researcher, and he's done extensive research and examination of this issue. On the basis of several distinctive and identifying features, he judges the Harper fragment to be parietal bone. These features include 1. A pattern of vascular grooving consistent with parietal bone and inconsistent with occipital bone. 2. A lack of the deep sulci, the grooves found in occipital bone. 3. A smooth inner surface, mild curvature, and relatively uniform thickness. 3. Parietal foramina, that is, vascular perforations of a type that occur only in parietal bone, and that's visible in the photographs of the Harper fragment. Joe Riley believes that, in spite of the initial judgment by A.B. Cairns, the clear weight of the medical expertise sides with the Harper fragment being parietal bone, and its placement not from the back, but rather at the top and the side of the head. And then there is Dr. David Mantik. David Mantik argues just the opposite. In Murder in Dealey Plaza, he states that the Harper fragment is mostly occipital bone, that autopsy photo number 44, otherwise known as F8, shows the outer rear of JFK's skull, and the Harper fragment fits neatly into a vacancy in the rear skull seen in that photograph. David Mantik received his doctorate in physics from the University of Wisconsin, and he was a member of the physics faculty at the university before leaving for medical school. He completed his internship and residency in radiation oncology at the USC Medical Center in L.A. He also completed fellowships in physics at the University of Illinois and in biophysics at Stanford University. Mantik has carried out extensive research into the assassination of JFK. This includes detailed studies of Kennedy's autopsy x-rays and the Zapruder film. In 1993, Mantik disclosed that after examining the autopsy x-rays at the National Archives, they had been altered, and that there were at least 2 shots which struck the president's head, and that the magic bullet theory is anatomically impossible. Mantik, along with Robert Livingston, Charles Crenshaw, Ronald White, Jack White, they all contributed to a book called Assassination Science, which you've heard me refer to before. It's a book that was also edited by James Fetzer. Mantik also contributed to a number of other important studies on this topic. Whether you aspire to believe one of these theories or another, these are all, by definition, highly intelligent, highly intellectual individuals who have a basis for studying these materials and coming to some form of conclusion, if one can be made. In the end, it's a simple question without a simple answer. Who are you going to believe? And what are you going to believe? That is really the question. The Harper fragment is gone, missing. Another one of those mysteries inside the JFK assassination story, and one of the circumstances where the facts in the case are stranger than fiction. Any positive identification of the fragment as being from the occipital region would surely put to rest all the controversy. The simple controversy over whether there was a hole in the back of the president's head. But if that is true, if this was occipital bone, it opens up a Pandora's box of all kinds of things. Were photos faked? Were x-rays faked? Were reports faked? Wasn't there a shot from the front and thus 2 shooters? No doubt the trail of concerns accumulates to an avalanche of bad news for the Warren Commission and even the HSCA conclusions about many things, including the idea, ultimately, of a conspiracy in the shooting as well as a conspiracy in the cover-up, which occurred in the aftermath. Maybe 2 different events, but certainly raising the idea that both were conspiratorial in nature and quite possibly happened, based on what this one piece of evidence might be telling us in a total vacuum. That's why the Harper fragment has celebrity status in the world of evidence related to the JFK assassination. Don't you wish you could hear directly from Dr. Berkeley himself? He seems to hold the key to the whereabouts of the fragment. Well, maybe. Or someone at the FBI. Would Dr. Berkeley know something more, though? Perhaps have been motivated to keep any piece of evidence out of the public eye that suggested more than the government's lone gunman story used to create the initial narrative after the assassination? We'll take a closer look at this very topic in the very next episode. One more fact in the case that is stranger than fiction.
So, and my position is no, there's no single bullet theory, no matter how simple you want to keep it. Second item you see is the anterior brain. On the x-rays, which you saw, especially the lateral x-ray, which we can visit again if you like, there's a very dark area in front of the brain. It's almost fist-sized, and it has just about as much brain in it as the frontal sinus does, according to the optical density measurements. So no frontal brain on either left or right, but you just saw the brain photographs, didn't you? Or if you didn't, Robert Groden has copies of them here, and they show nearly intact brain on both left and right. How do we reconcile that? In my opinion, one of those must be inauthentic. Either the x-rays are telling us a lie or the photograph of the brain is telling us a lie. I can't reconcile those. I've never found anyone who could.
Thank you for listening to episode 89 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 90. After more than 20 episodes related to the medical autopsy, we know Admiral George Berkeley well. In many ways, he was one of the central figures in the assassination of President Kennedy. We know from previous episodes that Dr. George Berkeley was President Kennedy's personal physician. Admiral Berkeley was the only medically qualified witness to possess first-hand knowledge of every aspect of JFK's wounds and treatment. Berkeley was in the motorcade in Dallas. He was present in the emergency room at Parkland Hospital, and he had attended the autopsy at Bethesda. Dr. Berkeley's insight into the JFK assassination medical evidence was, however, overlooked by the official investigative agencies. As I have said before, Dr. Berkeley was not called to testify before the Warren Commission. Berkeley did, however, make two contributions to the documentary record, both of which tended to undermine the notion that Lee Harvey Oswald alone had killed Kennedy. Admiral Berkeley signed the president's death certificate, and on the back of the death certificate he placed an interesting notation. It read as follows. The back wound was located, and I quote, at about the level of the third thoracic vertebra. It should also be noted that the autopsy pad, which was used by the pathologists at Bethesda that night to draw the official diagram of where the wounds were located, the same one we have talked about in a number of prior episodes. And remember, that drawing is part of the official elements of the autopsy report and supporting notes. Well, it shows the back wound in the same location as where Dr. Berkeley noted it to be when he made the notation on the death certificate. And to top it off, he himself made a mark on the pathologist's drawing, marking and signing it with a notation, and I quote, verified. Why is all of this important? Well, the third thoracic vertebra is typically 4 to 6 inches or 10 to 15 centimeters below the point at which the shoulders meet the neck. and it's consistent with the location of the bullet holes in the backs of President Kennedy's shirt and jacket, both of which are almost 6 inches below the tops of the collars of those two garments. A bullet that entered Kennedy's back at a downward angle at this location could not have gone on to injure Governor Conley, let alone go through the president's neck after having entered from the back. If Berkeley's evidence is correct, then this information, in and of itself, would call into question the validity of the Warren Commission's single bullet theory, and the assassination could not have been the work of just one gunman, for all the reasons that we have cited in previous episodes. We do know that the pathologists present at Bethesda that night, in later testimony, rejected the idea that the notation on the pathologist diagram pad was anything other than an imprecise notation taken down as a note during the course of the autopsy. But why then does it correlate precisely with the independent information documented by Berkeley in Dallas at the moment he signed the death certificate? Well, there is more to this story. In 1977, George Berkeley's lawyer contacted Richard Sprague, who was the then chief counsel of the newly established House Select Committee on Assassinations. This was before Sprague resigned the role in the turmoil of politics that took place during the HSCA's formation and its early existence. Robert Illig claimed in a letter to Sprague that Berkeley, and I quote, has information in the Kennedy assassination indicating that others besides Oswald must have participated. Illig went on to say that Berkeley was willing to talk. Sprague wrote a memo for the record, and so I'll read it in its entirety to you. It's not long, so here we go. It's a memorandum to file from Richard Sprague, dated March 18th, 1977. William F. Illig, an attorney from Erie, Pennsylvania, contacted me in Philadelphia this date, advising me that he represents Dr. George G. Berkeley, Vice Admiral, U.S. Navy retired, who had been the personal physician for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. Mr. Illig stated that he had a luncheon meeting with his client, Dr. Berkeley, this day to take up some tax matters. Dr. Berkeley advised him that although he, Berkeley, had signed the death certificate of President Kennedy in Dallas, he had never been interviewed, and that he has information in the Kennedy assassination indicating that others besides Oswald must have participated. Illig advised me that his client is a very quiet, unassuming person, not wanting any publicity whatsoever, but he, Illig, was calling me with his client's consent, and that his client would talk to me in Washington. Well, that's the end of the memo. Richard Sprague came under pressure from the media and from political opponents and, again, was obliged to resign from the HSCA. We all know that he was replaced by G. Robert Blakey, and to be fair, this is a memo written by Sprague and not first-hand testimony from Berkeley. Like the Warren Commission, though, the HSCA did not feel the need to interview Dr. Berkeley, who merely supplied them with an uninformative affidavit. With Sprague's resignation, we may have lost the one and only chance to formally interview and depose Dr. Berkeley under oath and to find out just exactly what he knew. And I am fairly confident that he must have known a lot. The HSCA did make some official mention of the interaction with Berkeley, but like so much else that they swept under the covers as it related to the medical evidence, this, too, was dealt with in what was a 1963 FBI/Warren-esque way, kept right there for all to see, but described benignly and simply buried in the massive record of the HSCA's final report, just like so many things were treated in 1964 in the Warren Commission report. What did the HSCA report say? Well, simply that Dr. Berkeley, through his attorney, suggested to the HSCA that he might, I place emphasis on the word might, have some additional information about the autopsy. This nondescript statement was what the HSCA placed in its final report, and you might think that Dr. Berkeley was referring to something both indefinite and possibly trivial, instead of a definite claim, true or not, that actually challenged the very foundation of the official story. So think carefully about the statement I just read to you that was in the HSCA report and compare it to the actual words in the Sprague memo. And I quote that, "He has information in the Kennedy assassination indicating that others besides Oswald must have participated." End quote. The HSCA finally did admit that Berkeley believed in conspiracy, but they did so without acknowledging that his belief was based on first-hand information, and they buried it in a place where you would not expect to find it, in the chapter Pursuit of Records and Information from Non-Federal Sources. Well, even though the HSCA missed its chance to engage with Berkeley in the late 1970s, as time went on, Berkeley would make at least 2 references regarding the presence of a conspiracy that had been left for dead, ending up as a hanging chad, so to speak, in the historical record related to the JFK assassination. If only the interviewers had tugged just a little bit more on the thread and asked the obvious next question. Well, let's discuss those 2 incidents now. First, in an oral history interview with the Kennedy Library, Admiral Berkeley was asked whether he agreed with the Warren Commission's conclusions about, and I quote, "the number of bullets that entered the president's body." He replied, and I quote, "I would not care to be quoted on that." In addition to that, the author Henry Hurt claims that in 1982, Dr. Berkeley told him in a telephone conversation that he believed that President Kennedy's assassination was the result of a conspiracy. You can read more about that in Henry Hurt's book, A Reasonable Doubt, an investigation into the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Unfortunately, some 60 years after the assassination, these titans of men are all gone now. Well, most of them anyway. There have been various attempts to try to obtain papers from Robert Illig's estate, papers that might be relevant to the Kennedy assassination. Illig, again, is the lawyer from Erie, Pennsylvania, who represented Dr. Berkeley and who reached out to Richard Sprague. To my knowledge, these attempts were all rebuffed by the estate's executors and Illig's surviving family. It's nothing less than a reasonable supposition, then, that perhaps somewhere in the locked cabinets of Illig's law offices or in some safety deposit box somewhere, there was placed a written record taken down from Dr. Berkeley. A written record of what might have happened in those few days in November and what he really knew about them, based on his first-hand knowledge. Of course, this is purely conjecture on my part, the kind of stuff you think up when you're thinking of a Dan Brown novel. But really, maybe we don't even need to suppose, because the truth that is present, well, you can't write this stuff. As I said, most of these titans are all gone now. But there is one titan still chugging along with all of the sound and fury related to this matter that he had when he was younger. It's still there, even in his later years. That man is Cyril Wecht. A few years back, he participated in an interview and talk session with the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas, and he made his case for conspiracy. It wasn't the first time he'd done that. In the remainder of this episode, we are going to sit back and listen to Dr. Wecht make his case for us. In that 6th Floor Museum interview that took place almost 35 years after he sat before the House Select Committee on Assassinations and was allowed to voice his opinion as the lone dissenter on the medical panel, the only one of those men to publicly reject the medical findings of the committee. And he, too, did that with sound and fury. So without further ado, let's listen to Cyril Wecht make his case for conspiracy in episode 90 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here tonight. I want to jump right in because we got a lot to cover in a very short time span. Dr. Wecht, I'd love to go back to where it all started for all of us, November of 1963. You were pretty busy at this point in your life. You were a pathologist at a VA hospital. You were also part of a law firm. Tell us a little bit about your life when you learned that the president had been shot.
Yes, I had finished my 2 years in the Air Force and then went to Baltimore for my 5th year in forensic pathology and my 3rd year of law school, which had been interrupted by the military assignment, but that all worked out well. I even met my wife there. And came back to Pittsburgh in end of July, beginning of August of '62. And then I was a pathologist at a VA hospital and starting to do medical legal consultations and became part of a law firm, right?
So you were pacing yourself.
Yeah, right. And I already had our first boy was born, now a state Supreme Court justice in Pennsylvania. We were talking, Stephen and I, about '63, and I was reminiscing that a Republican broke through Allegheny County, Pittsburgh, overwhelmingly, strongly Democratic ever since post-World War II days. But a Republican was elected district attorney following somewhat of a scandal, and an attorney who had been a good friend of mine in law school, in Pitt undergrad, was somewhat active in the Republican Party, recommended me to him to be an assistant district attorney and medical legal advisor to the DA. And so I was doing that then as of January of '64. He was elected in the first Tuesday of November '63. Stephen, I paid attention like any intelligent American, but I can't say that I knew anything really about the case. I just knew what I was reading. And as everybody here knows, whichever side of this controversial matter you are on, insofar as the news media establishment from then until this day as we sit here now, overwhelmingly, enthusiastically, rigidly behind the Warren Commission report. So I'm sure I'm correct in saying that there could not have been very much. I guess some people raised some questions, but then my involvement in the case did not begin until in late '64, while sitting with my good friend Charlie McInerney, head of the crime lab, as we called it, the forensic science lab in the district attorney's office where it was quartered. Charlie was a member of the program committee of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Every year the Academy meets third, fourth week of February, and they have multiple divisions, pathology, toxicology, criminalistics, psychiatry, question documents, etc. And they have a plenary session. Each section meets separately most of the time, but they try to come up with a subject that will hold the interest of most of the different sections. Charlie said, we're going to do a Warren Commission report in the '65 meeting. Would you like to represent the pathology section? And I said, sure. And I went to the Carnegie Library, with this great, magnificent library. Carnegie Library, I think everybody knows Andrew Carnegie made his fortune in Pittsburgh, and we've been blessed with that, Carnegie Mellon University now, and so on. So I went there, and they already had the 26 volumes.
This is in late '64?
Yeah, late '64, because the meeting, late '64, when it come out, late September, early October, right? So they got them damn fast. And by the way, I bought a set too somewhere along the line later on for $75. How much does a 26-volume set cost?
I couldn't tell you. We have a few.
$75 is what it cost them. So I went to the library, and I immediately, I go to the index, right? I want to get into the pathology and the medical stuff and so on. Ain't no index, baby. Ain't no index, okay? From the very, because, and then this is a good point to mention, as you and I were talking, somebody, a dear friend, a wonderful woman, Sylvia Marr, and people should know, this woman, divorced, living alone, single woman, I think she had a job, I think she worked at the United Nations, I'm not sure. This is back then, in the, late '60s or so on. no computers, right? Nobody even dreaming about computers, as far as I know. She puts together an index. The point I'm making is the government putting out 26 volumes, no index, that's already, in my mind, part of, I'm not saying they sat down and, you sketch everything out like some big military battle. We're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. But this is the way the chips fell, beginning with J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. How do you know in a matter of a couple of days or so? Forget what anybody believes about the conspiracy. In a murder here in Dallas or Pittsburgh, unless you got something cold, dead, witnesses, but you got a murder, and how do you know in 2-3 days? And then they find out that you're the murderer. How do they know that I didn't collaborate with you? How do they know I didn't drive you that night? How can you know that? How was it possible for Hoover to know that he had cleared the deck of everybody with Oswald? So the point I'm making, that was the milieu. That was what was out there. And then for me, it flowed. I gave my paper, and a couple of FBI agents were in the audience. We came to learn. Hoover already had them. Can you believe that? At the Academy. Not to hear what forensic scientists were saying.
And it's safe to say that first paper in February of '65 was critical of the commission's findings.
Yes, but nowhere near as critical, as it came to be later on, because I still hadn't seen, a lot of these things. Right. So I remember, then I got contacted. That's how I came to know Sylvia Maher. That's how I came to know Mark Lane, and then Josiah Tink Thompson contacted me. Tink had somehow gotten a spot with Life magazine to review this Zapruder film.
Yeah.
Asked me, we hadn't met, called me up and told me who he was, and I went out there, I think December of '65, right? Uh-huh. Studied the Zapruder film, and so that when began to open up the door, and I became involved and so on, and then
you met Jim Garrison.
The Jim Garrison then contacted me in 68, and met with him and reviewed everything. And then that was my first, I've testified 3 times under oath in this case. The first one was in federal court in January, I believe, of 69 or December.
December of 68.
December of 68. December 68. Garrison went into federal court to get access for me to the autopsy. I'm going to testify in a murder case. The judge, I remember it, and I remember who he was, Charles Halleck Jr. His father was the GOP leader of the House of Representatives for many years from Indiana. I didn't know. He was the federal judge. And he ruled from the bench immediately that the government must allow Dr. Wecht in. And I'll never forget, as an attorney, I was absolutely dumbfounded when the U.S. attorneys, whoever they were, got up and in a very arrogant fashion says, and I remember they were, "We will fight this until hell freezes over." I had a hell of a dilemma in my mind, because a young guy to get involved and to testify and so on. But I had the good sense, and I'm proud of myself. I said, "Mr. Garrison, I can't testify as a forensic pathologist if I haven't seen the autopsy report." And so I did not then testify, and the trial went ahead. And then the next time was very interesting too. You all know about the so-called executive order, the Jackie Kennedy. She became the owner of everything, right? She owned the clothing and the gun and the bullets. It's all hers. Yeah. The last person in the world, I think, that would have ever even wanted to see anything like that probably was Jacqueline Kennedy. But they came up with this cockamamie thing. It was April of '65. She gave this gift, and then in a year and a half
to the
later,
National Archives.
National Archives. 1.5 years later, October '66, they went back, and I think 2 or 3 of the original people went back, and a couple of others, and they reviewed everything. And I'll get back to that in a moment. So in any event, in her gift, it stated that you can't get access, nobody, for 75 years, with the exception that a, quote, recognized expert in the field of pathology with a serious historic purpose, interest in 5 years could apply. So I was mindful of that. I had become increasingly involved. So came October of 71, I fired off a letter to Burke Marshall, who, as Assistant Attorney General under Bobby Kennedy, was the executor of that agreement, that gift. Then a professor of law at Yale. He never responded. I wrote a second letter, no response. One day I get a call, Fred Graham, New York Times. He introduces himself. Somebody's told him that I'm applying. And I said, yes, Mr. Graham, that's true. And he said, well, I'll get back to you in a couple weeks or so. He did. And he called me back and asked me if I'd heard anything. And I said, no. I'll never forget this. He said, not in an arrogant way, I mean, just in a matter-of-fact way. Like he said, do you mind, he said, if I call Professor Marshall, sometimes people respond to the New York Times. I'll never forget that. And I said, fine. So it worked. Then I finally hear back from Burke Marshall. He's going on Christmas holiday. Then it already is now into 72. And now he says, I got to come to New Haven. Well, little did he know, that's my second home. We still have a home outside New Haven in the shore there. And my cousin and my best friends, one of whom everybody knows from Lender's Bagels. I used to go and deliver bagels with Murray late at night. But anyway, so I was delighted to go to New Haven. And he interviewed me. And finally I got in. And then that's when I got in August. And that's when I became aware of those agreements. And I became aware of the difference between what was listed in April 65 and what was inventoried and listed a year and a half later in October of 66, including a big metal box, which absolutely held the brain. There's no question about it, with formalin. And some photographs and other things. And that was the front page story of New York Times, page 1, by Fred Graham, because he had the exclusive with me, of course, the President's Brain Missing. And we'll talk about that. And to this day, as far as I'm concerned, it remains missing. Oh, we'll have people, I'm sure, in the audience here who still believe, people I've heard this many times, that, well, the Kennedys took and so on. Yeah, hey, the Kennedys had every right to do that. A lot of people, Orthodox Jews for religious reasons, and Muslims, and I feel that way about tissues and so on. They had every right to. But I've challenged everybody and anybody to this day to show me anything at all that indicates that that was done. And not that the Kennedys have to answer to me, but my point on that is that if they had done that, just simply make that statement indirectly through a spokesperson, and that's it. Would you want somebody to continue to talk about your father's brain or your mother's heart every day, or somebody like Weck talking about this? That's terrible. The point I'm making is that brain is missing. Where it is, but I know damn well why it's missing, because that brain would prove the points I'm going to be making in a short while. So that was then the next big time, the Rockefeller Commission invited me to testify, and I remember testifying for about 5 hours. We went on and on for 5 hours in 75. And then in 78, I was appointed as a member of the Forensic Pathology Panel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which was established in 77, right? Mm-hmm. And they had the different panels. And I and 8 other board-certified forensic pathologists met, and I gave my sole minority dissenting report before the entire Congress. I remember Congressman Stokes, and there was even a congressman from Pennsylvania, I think Bob Edgar. And so that was the third time that I testified under oath. And then Oliver Stone contacted me and asked me if I'd be a consultant, and I said yes, and went down to New Orleans, and that was a fascinating time. I remember going there, the old courthouse on Bourbon or Royal Street, one of those streets, and that's where they were filming. I'll never forget, there were Kevin Costner, Garrison, right? And Joe Pesci, David Ferry.
Right.
And Costner is asking Pesci, Garrison is asking Ferry, what were you doing in Dallas? He said, duck hunting.
It's a famous scene in the movie.
This is the true story. They cracked up. They had to do that scene about 5-6 times. They couldn't stop laughing. And then finally they finished, and Oliver Stone introduced me to them. Before I could tell Kevin Costner, this is one of the highlights of my life. Before I could tell Kevin Costner that my wife was in love with him, he said, "Oh, you're that guy with the Kennedy business, right?" The thing I wanted to mention about Oliver Stone, and we've become friends, and he's been to Pittsburgh for some programs, and he gave me a manuscript, and he said, "This has been edited and re-edited, and we can't change anything. I just want you to check to make sure that there's no forensic, scientific, or medical, technical inaccuracy." And there was only one that I picked up. They had grams for the bullet weight instead of grains. But what I'm very proud of, and the reason I'm mentioning this is, I had already been doing something that I do want to talk about, the Kennedy assassination, of positioning Kennedy and Connally, the two people from the audience. Do that everywhere, including.
This is the scene in the courtroom where
yeah.
Kevin
So I begged him to do it, and he did it, and that's the scene in the movie. And I take credit. Not, I'm sure other people had done it, but I mean to get it into the script, and I think people remember that. So then that's continued, and been active with various groups. I got a lot of colleagues here. I'm not going to start naming names, although Bob Groden, Deborah Conway, and many others who have been stalwarts in this for so many years, and so on.
Let me ask you a question, because you have been so passionate about this over the years. You're known for your passion. Where does that passion come from? We're talking about something that happened 53 years ago. Why do you continue
That's
to?
a question that I'm asked always, and it's not feigned, it's not forced. It just comes. I guess it's just a combination. Number one, my personality. I get involved, and I do believe in things strongly and form opinions. That's part of it. My genetics and so on, but that is coupled with what I feel is important about this case, and why it should not be forgotten, and why it has to continue to be pursued. And we'll see how it unfolds at the end of the year, when all these additional records are to be released in October under the 1992 Congressional Act, JFK Records Release Act, calling for the release of all the documents that were withheld. And I've been chair of CAPI, that, as Longford mentioned, Citizens Against Political Assassinations. There have been other organizations in the past, and a lot of people have done some tremendous work. I'm not going to get into names because I'll forget somebody, I'm sure. But we're pursuing this, and we're keeping our ear to the ground. We had a marvelous program March 16th, the National Press Club. One of our colleagues, Andrew Craig, set up. He's a member there, and it was a wonderful program. But it's a great program. The chief presenter was Judge Tonheim. Now, John Tonheim was appointed by President Clinton as head of the ARRB.
Assassination Records Review Board.
Assassination Records Review Board. Okay? And he at that time was in the Attorney General's office in Minnesota. The following year, I think, Clinton appointed them to the federal bench. And that group existed for about 3.5, 4 years. The ARRB, I remember meeting him back then and been on a program. We had 2 big programs at the Wecht Institute of Forensic Science in Pittsburgh and Duquesne University in 2003, the 40th, and 2013, the 50th. So Judge Tonheim now, the chief judge of the federal court in Minneapolis, the chief judge, Minneapolis, okay? He's there, the National Press Club, talking for a whole hour about this business. Zero coverage by the news media establishment. Zero coverage, okay? If there had been a car accident in D.C., it would have been mentioned. If Joe Jones had shot Mary Smith or whoever, that would have been covered. I mean, how can you, how can this be? But this is, this in and of itself can be a discussion for an entire night, the news media establishment, but I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah. Well, we're going to see some of your passion on display in just a moment because you have a presentation to give us here. I'm going to leave the stage during this portion of the program. You have question cards that should have been in your seats. We're going to collect those towards the end of Dr. Wecht's lecture, and then I will come back to the stage and we'll go through some questions and conclude our evening. So I will be back in a few minutes. Dr. Wecht, Dr. Cyril Wecht.
This discussion with Cyril Wecht continues in episode 91, and the finish is spectacular. Thank you for listening to episode 90 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK, The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 91. Today, we continue and finish up this mini-series with part 2 of Cyril Wecht's Case for Conspiracy. It's an episode with riveting excerpts from his talk and interview that was conducted by Stephen Fagan at the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas, sometime around 2013. Even into his 80s at the time of this interview, Dr. Wecht has a presence in a room, and you'll hear and feel it in this episode. This colorful, world-renowned pathologist makes his case for conspiracy. And he makes us laugh a bit along the way, too. And he reminds us all that common sense goes a long way, and that we shouldn't check it at the doors, so to speak, just because the government said something was so. His own common sense, no BS approach reinforces that we should just call it like it is sometimes. And he sure does. You'll hear that for yourselves. You will be nothing less than entertained as you listen to this, again, world-renowned pathologist. He'll entertain you and push you into thinking independently and combining it with your own common sense as a juror to come to a conclusion that is diametrically opposed to the conclusions of the Warren Commission. You'll hear commentary on many, many things in this episode. Was there a shot from the grassy knoll? You'll hear what Cyril thinks. Was Oswald the shooter? You'll hear what Cyril thinks. Dr. Wecht has some pretty pointed comments on Allen Dulles, too. Maybe even explosive, I might say. One thing Dr. Wecht is keen on, and I know from speaking to him personally that this is quite genuine, is that he believes each generation should be informed about the true facts of this political assassination. In a seriously humorous moment, he insists that public libraries should have a copy of the 26 volumes of the Warren Report on the shelf for just that reason, so that the people of the current generation can be informed about what exactly was said and what exactly the government wanted its people to believe in 1964. He also has a suggestion on what shelf the Warren Commission report should be filed on in the library. You'll find that answer invigorating. Does Cyril think that the Russians or the Cubans or the Chinese or the Mafia were involved? Well, you get his views on that too. Early on in the podcast, I think it was about 35 episodes in, I can't quite remember right now, well, I got an email from an educator in Chicago, and he had decided that he was going to go on a cross-country trip to the West Coast. He was a high school teacher who taught, as I recall, I think it was social studies or something similar, and each November he would ask his students to do a study module on the JFK assassination. When he found our podcast, it really got his attention, and he binged on the podcast along with one other news channel, CNN, I believe. And so we rode with him all the way to the West Coast and back. I am guessing, as my memory of it is not that good now, but I think his round trip was more than 40 hours. He said he was going to have his students use the podcast to help gain a better understanding of the assassination and what it meant, and to learn more about what actually happened. I shared that little tidbit with Dr. Weck last year, not long after it took place. I think he liked it. He chuckled when I told him it was a podcast. Certainly not like a volume of the Warren Commission report that most certainly is covered in a layer of dust, but unlike the podcast, you can still find it in a library. Dr. Weck found it originally in the great Carnegie Library in Pittsburgh. I am proud to be helping pass this story along to the next generation using current generation technology, and to keep alive the idea that someday we might recover the remaining portion of the whole truth, a whole truth that even today remains an enduring secret. As far as binging on the episodes go, I have another success story, and it comes this week from a friend and a colleague, one recently attained as part of my current work assignment in West Virginia. Mark Gilliam is a real gentleman, and he is from Kentucky. And when his Wildcats were recently upset by St. Peter's in the NCAA March Madness tournament, well, Mark needed to do something to take his mind off the upset, and my podcast was the recipient. He binged on almost 80 episodes, I think. Wow, new record. Thanks, Mark. You inspire me to do more, and I am sorry about the Wildcats, but I'll take the downloads any way I can get them. Mark, you and others will have to listen in on this episode to hear Dr. Wecht and his answers to those most important questions, and even more, as he challenges anyone to believe that the narrative of the Warren Commission was the whole truth, or even the truth for that matter. As Dr. Wecht so eloquently points us to, pointing to the words of a prominent government official, the Warren Commission was simply a convenient political truth. You know, I think Dr. Wecht likes colloquialisms as much as I do. I guess it's a rather generational thing, and it's funny to hear him make a reference to the good old boys in the South, referring to Warren Commission members, including Congressman Wade Boggs of Louisiana and also Georgia Senator Russell Long, and to make it clear that they weren't fooled by the manufactured narrative of a lone gunman. I guess it's his version of "that dog don't hunt." Anyway, it's fun to listen to. In the end, Dr. Wecht might be talking about the autopsy, but it's really a talk that is chock full of common sense, sage advice about human beings and their human tendencies. But even he believes that you can't write this stuff and find it in a novel. Dr. Wecht is probably one of the last titans left that has been right there in the arena on this matter since the beginning, and searching for the truth related to the Kennedy assassination. So that means that he's been doing it for the last 60 years. Maybe Dr. Wecht would say that it's been more like wandering in the desert. He's now been an inspiration to many, and he's into his 90s now himself, but he's still going strong. I hope Dr. Wecht is here when the enduring secret is finally revealed. In that moment, I have no doubt that he will be up on the dais to receive the golden key. To that end, this episode is dedicated to Dr. Wecht. So now, without further ado, let's listen to episode 91 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
This was not Jonathan A. Ramsey, where the passage of those hours in those two cases make it very difficult to know exactly what happened because of the procrastination, the delay, the negligence of the people involved in those cases. In this case, we don't have a problem. We know when he was shot, where he was shot, and that he died from being shot. So you had all the time in the world to get together the top forensic pathologists in the country. Milton Halpern, then chief medical examiner in New York City. He was a wonderful man. Everybody considered him the number one guy. Milton Halpern, he already had his bag packed. I know this from Milton. This is true. He had his bag packed. He had already made calls to a couple of other of the top forensic pathologists, one of whom I think was the chief where I trained, Russell Fisher in Baltimore, Joe Spellman in Philadelphia, Alan Morris in Boston, formerly of Cleveland, to go there with him. Not that he was cocky and arrogant, but, this is what you're going to do. Well, no. Not one of them was called. Think about this from the very beginning. This was a military-controlled operation. Humes and Boswell at Bethesda Naval Hospital, where it was decided that the autopsy would be done because of Kennedy's naval history, were called in to do the autopsy. And this, I love to say this, and I must admit, I get devilish delight in doing this because amongst you, I don't know what the percentage is, whether you're a minuscule representation of the entire country, and there are anywhere from 20 to 40% of you who believe the Warren Commission, or whether it's more, I don't know. But there are certainly some people here, I'm sure, who believe it. And I want you to know this. I want you to know your evidentiary burden. You got to live with this, baby, if you're going to court. Humes and Boswell, you got this case. Multiple gunshot wounds of the president, multiple gunshot wounds of Governor Connally. You've got to determine angle, trajectory, sequence, correlation of Kennedy's wounds to Connally's wounds. That is a frightening, it takes hours and hours. You can spend hours and hours and so on. Humes and Boswell, the two Bethesda Naval Hospital pathologists, had never done a single gunshot wound autopsy in their entire careers. Not a single gunshot wound autopsy in their entire careers. This is America. This is our country. I was recently interviewed by somebody in Sweden on the still unsolved death of their Prime Minister, Olof Palme. And I said, by the way, who did the autopsy? The chief forensic pathologist, of course, at the Institute of Forensic Science. You go and you look at any one of the political assassinations in any country, including Africa, Asia, and Europe, and I'll bet you anything. You can consider this a bet to a fine meal somewhere. You will find, if you have a top official that has been assassinated in any one of those countries over the years, that the autopsy was done by the top people at the Institute of Forensic Science, whatever they call it, okay? So I want you to know that. All right, well, am I just excited and passionate, as Steve says? Right? Because am I intellectually affronted? Am I chauvinistically deplored as a forensic pathologist? Well, let's see. Now we get to the heart of the case from a medical standpoint. Let's go back to the 18 doctors right here in Dallas at Parkland Hospital. They don't know a thing about this assassination, right? I mean, they don't know. They're doctors. They're doing their thing. Trauma surgeons, and they're called in. You've got a dozen. This is on record. This is on camera. One of them, Dr. McClellan, we had him in our 2013 conference live, this wonderful surgeon, now retired. Every one of them talked about the defect in the back of the skull. Kemp Clark, the chief of neurosurgery, do you think he knows the difference between cerebellum and cerebral hemisphere? What do you think? Okay? He said he held the cerebellum in his hand. In his hand, that's back here. The base, posterior base of the brain, the cerebellum. That's what they saw. Who do you believe? Who do you believe? These guys or the people there at Bethesda who have never done a gunshot wound autopsy in their entire careers? And by the way, talking about passion and being upset, how would you feel? I love to come up with this retrospective, metaphorical presentation. What if the president wasn't shot that day? He slipped in the bathtub, taking a shower, struck his head, and became groggy. Maybe he was unconscious for a short while. So I'd ask you, non-medical people, whom would you call? So you say, well, I want a neurologist. You say a neurosurgeon. You say an internist to check his heart and lung status. And you know a little about medicine. You say an ophthalmologist, look at the eye grounds, because sometimes an intracranial hemorrhage can be manifested on ophthalmological examination, okay? What if, under my metaphorical presentation, they had called in to evaluate Kennedy and his concussion, they had called in a dermatologist, a plastic surgeon, and an obstetrician? How would you feel about that, okay? Okay? Does it take much to make somebody passionate, to make somebody pissed off? I mean, you got to accept that kind of total bull. I mean, this is what you're dealing with. And I'm hammering that. I know I'm hammering it because I want people who believe in the Warren Commission to understand what you are dealing with. All right, now let's go on and see. Oh, no, hold on. Let me go back. This is the sketch. This is the sketch that they made that night. They show, you see, in the back, the wound up there, the figure on the right-hand side. And, of course, the figure on the left, the curvy linear in the neck. On the night of the autopsy, these two totally incompetent, completely inexperienced guys missed a bullet hole in the president's neck. I want you to take a look at the person sitting next to you. You think you need 4 years of college, pre-med, 4 years of medical school, and 5 years of pathology to see that the person next to you has a bullet hole with blood coming out in the neck. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think, huh? So how the hell did they miss it? Because the doctors here at Parkland had immediately recognized that the bullet had fortuitously ripped through the trachea. When you have somebody with a head injury or a stroke, you got to take over for the brain. The brain is the boss. The brain controls everything. So you got to do what the brain does. And you got to get out carbon dioxide, put in oxygen, and suction out blood and mucus, and you do a tracheostomy. Well, the bullet had made the tracheostomy for them, but they had to expand the hole somewhat, described as a 7 by 4 millimeter hole. They had to expand it in order to attach the tubing from the oxygen machine. And so these guys who did the autopsy that night, including Fink, who came over. I was a third pathologist. He had some experience in forensic pathology, essentially dealing with military weaponry. Pierre Fink I knew personally from my visits to the AFIP, missed the bullet hole. It wasn't until the next morning, I told you before about the passage of time, they had an opportunity to talk with the surgeons here in Dallas and learn. You always do that if you have somebody that's been operated upon and so on. They never did that. And now on Saturday morning, November 23rd, they learned for the first time that they had missed a bullet hole on the President of the United States. How do you handle that? How do you handle that? I'll tell you how you handle it. If you're Asian, you commit suicide. If you're European, you resign. If you're an American, you just bull your way out of it. That's the way you handle it, okay? That's it. So now, how did they deal with the bullet holes on Friday night, November 22nd? Oh, this is lovely, too. They're probing the back wound, finger, instrument, feel nothing. Do x-rays, see nothing. Open up the chest, take out the lungs, find nothing. Can you just imagine if you were there? And just then, like one of those horrible movies, terrible movies, they come on late at night, and it's 1:30, and the station's going off the air at 2 o'clock. You can predict what's going to happen. It has to happen because there's only a half hour left with commercials. Something had to happen. Well, sure enough, the FBI called in to the FBI from Dallas to D.C., and they had found a bullet beneath, to this day, I don't believe that it's something say on the stretcher, beneath the stretcher, whose stretcher. It's a Jackie Mason routine. His stretcher, her stretcher, you know. I could just see Jackie Mason doing this, my God. Okay? And, said the pathologist at Bethesda, when the president lay on his back, supine, and the doctors applied pressure to the front of his chest, that pressure applied to the front of his chest forced a bullet that they knew had gone deeply into the tissues back out through the same channel and through the same hole. Well, it doesn't work that way. It's not like putting your car in reverse. In Pittsburgh, we've got these big tunnels, and I talk about Fort Pitt and Liberty tunnels. You go into the tunnel, and you decide you're going in the wrong direction, and you just back up and go back out. It doesn't work that way. When a bullet strikes, the tissues become hemorrhagic. They become edematous. They encase the bullet. Bullets don't flop around, unless you're talking about lying free in the abdominal cavity or the chest cavity. But if they are in tissues, muscular, fascia, tendons, ligaments, whatever, they become encased. And you got to dig for them and spend sometimes a lot of time, even with x-rays, looking for the damn bullet. But that's what they concluded that night. So that's where the stretcher bullet, Commission Exhibit 399, the hero of the single bullet theory, came from on Friday night. The next morning, when they learned about the bullet hole in the front of Kennedy's neck, now the bullet had gone through from the back out of his neck and saw this starch white collar, got frightened to death, fell in the front of his clothing, and now the bullet is from the front of Kennedy's clothing, okay? And now they're in good shape. Everything's fine. Everything's taken care of, right? They submit their report, and that's it. Well, along comes a guy named Abraham Zapruder, who took the pictures here, and you all know about that, of course. And the film, which I had the opportunity to study with Tink Thompson, determined that 18.3 frames move through the film per second. 18.3 frames. And, you know, as the old people, somewhat older, remember putting on the spool of film inside the camera, and then each one of those little things is a frame, and study that at Life magazine. Blow-ups, I think they were 11 by 15 or 8 by 11 or something like that, and just going from frame to frame, and you're moving 1/18 of a second from picture to picture. There's not a word you can utter. There's not a thought you can entertain. There's not a movement you can make 18 times in 1 second. You can study this murder at 1/18 second intervals. And they did that. And they saw that John Connolly was struck about 1.5 seconds after Kennedy was hit the first time. Okay. Then they come up with the alleged murder weapon, Manicure Carcano, described by every long gun expert I've ever spoken to as the most inferior weapon of his genre developed anywhere in the world. I'll never forget, I had done a medical legal program in Italy in 1965. That was my first international program, and I put together another one in 1972, I think it was, and they asked me to speak about the Kennedy assassination, and I said, sure. And I was talking, and I saw some of the distinguished professors I had met in my previous visit, older than I at that time, and they were kind of smiling and giggling and a little bit, and I just felt so bad. So afterwards, I went to Silvio Merli, who had become the director and who spoke good English, and I said, Silvio, I feel terrible. I want to apologize if I said anything that was silly. He said, no, you don't understand. He says, when you were talking about the Manicure Carcano, he says, in Italy, the Manicure Carcano is considered to be an instrument of love, not a weapon of war. That is the Manicure Carcano. That's your weapon. And at that time, it took 2.3 seconds from shot to shot in the hands of the most skilled marksman, whoever they were. They got them lined up. I might have been Clint Eastwood or John Wayne, but, you know, I mean, who's fast on the draw and that not allowing time. Remember, it's a moving target and sporadically blocked by some tree branches, too, looking out that window down there below us, one floor. But 2.3 seconds. I know since then they talked about, well, somebody did it faster or that. In the meantime, before they came to realize the full impact of that was it in the hands of the most skilled marksman, shooting, as I recall, on a platform in an open field. 2.3 seconds. Well, how can that be? It can't be. How do you handle that seemingly impossible physical incongruity between the timing of the Zapruder film and the timing of the shooting of the Manicure Carcano? And that is when, junior legal counsel for the Warren Commission, later to become senior senator from Pennsylvania, Arlen Specter came up with the single bullet theory. Specter, very bright guy. And I'm not dumping on Specter in some kind of an ad hominem fashion. As a matter of fact, we became quite good friends. And in 2004, when he was running for re-election, he asked me if I would come out for him, and I was very active in Democratic politics. He was running for re-election as a Republican, and I did. And I came out for him, and I came out for him again in 2010. I just mentioned that so you'll know that, it's not my intention here to dump on Arlen Specter. In fact, I think he was brilliant to come up with how else were they going to handle this? How else were they going to handle it? It was Specter's idea. And that's what they ran with. And that's what they must live with to this day. The single bullet theory. Here it is. Here it is. The bullet hits Kennedy here about 6 inches below. Okay? Now to begin with, and this is a matter of record. I'll tell you if I'm conjecturing or speculating or giving you a subjective interpretation. This is a matter of record. The bullet exits here. It's 11.5 degrees upward. How did my esteemed colleagues on the forensic pathology panel handle that? Well, they said if the president was bent over, see, but Mr. President, don't tie your shoelace or scratch your groin. You're here to look at the crowd, Mr. President, okay? Please. The president was not bent over. Look at the Zapruder film. Forget Weck. Look at the Zapruder film. So the bullet fired from up there, coming down, right to left, back to front, up downward, goes upward 11.5 degrees, comes out, and you take the line, okay? 30 inches separate the president's chest from the governor's back. 30 inches, okay? The bullet come out. Now maybe caught him over here on the left side, grazed him, and maybe I wouldn't even be here speaking. The bullet hits him over here behind the right armpit. Behind the right armpit. Exits from below the nipple. Now you know why I always, as I told you, we always never have a woman as the governor. Except until I hear from Sophia Loren, then we're going to change that. Now, where was Connolly's hat? Where was that? Where was that? Was it here? Look, Governor, go look at the crowd. They love you. Governor, show them that big white Stetson hat, okay? Nipple here? Below the nipple. You tell me how that bullet coming down comes up and around, slams into the back of the wrist, inside the chest. It's destroyed 4 inches of the right fifth rib. Destroyed it. Perforated the lung, destroyed 4 inches of the right fifth rib anteriorly, exits from beneath the nipple, hooks up and around, goes into the back of the governor's wrist, shatters the distal end of the radius. And no background, there are two bones, elbow to wrist, radius and ulna. And the radius broadens. You have 8 little wrist bones here. The radius broadens. Connolly was 6'4", a big bone Texan. Big bone Texan. You're talking about a big bone. Exits, producing a comminuted fracture, exits from the front of the wrist and goes into the left thigh. And then, under the single bullet theory, that's where it came from. It worked its way out of the governor's left thigh. That is the single bullet theory. Thank you. Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Madam President. Let's talk about the head wound for a moment. I've already told you about what the doctors here at Parkland, having no script to read from, no scenario to sell, just what do you see? What do you see? Top experienced trauma surgeons, including neurosurgeon and his number one assistant, Robert Grossman, whom I came to know personally. My second son did 6 years of neurosurgical residency under Grossman in Houston. So 2 neurosurgeons talking about cerebellum. You see the way in which the president's body lurches. A motorcycle policeman riding just behind the left rear wheel of the president's car, was spattered with blood, some tissue, and was certain for several seconds that he had been shot. How did the government deal with that? Luis Alvarez, a major scientist in California, put some melons on a stand, on a fence, shot the melons. Some of the melons did come backward instead of going forward. Anything that was needed, they can come up with an answer. I want you to think of a bullet weighing 161 grains, 1.25 inches in length, 1/4 inch in diameter, copper-jacketed, lead-core military ammunition, moving 2,000 feet per second, slamming into the back of your head. Okay? How do you think you're going to move? How about right now, as you sit here, the person sitting behind you says, you conspiratorialist, I'll show you, and whacks you in the back of your head. Are you going to move? You're going to move backward, or are you going to move forward when he whacks you in the front of your head? What do you think? In the back of your head. What do you think? Okay? This is, you see, the present, the burst. But anyway, I ask this, really, that I ask this favor of you in all seriousness. If your school, where your children, your grandchildren go, that school, that particularly high school, certainly, college, university, does not have the 26 volumes, make sure that they get it. Because this is part of history of this country, indeed of the world. But then there is a corollary to my request, and that is that in addition to purchasing, you request that they put those volumes in the proper place in the library where they belong. Next to Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, that's where they belong, okay? It isn't difficult to become passionate about this, to think about what is involved here. What was the situation then? How long did it take for the government, our government, to determine that it wasn't the Russians, and it wasn't the Chinese, and it wasn't the Cubans, okay? They quickly determined, I love this from Pogo, we have met the enemy, and he is us. That's what this case is all about. Recently, one of the members of the Warren Commission legal staff, whom one of our CAPA board of directors knows, saw him, and they were talking, and then saw him again, and he asked, and he shared this with us. He asked this member, I won't give his name, he asked him, did he really think that the Warren Commission was correct? Did he think that the truth was told? And the answer, I thought, was beautiful. The answer that this man gave, a distinguished man, I wish I could tell you his name in relationship to somebody now currently involved in national government. He said it was the political truth. That's what this was all about. The Kennedy assassination was, when it happens in other countries, of a prime minister, of a king, of a dictator, it's called what it is. It is the assassination, the murder of the leader. It is the overthrow of the government. And that's what occurred in America on November 22nd, 1963. This was coup d'etat in America. That's what happened. And that's why everybody should be damn passionate about the JFK assassination and make damn sure that the 1992 Records Release Act, calling for the release of all the withheld documents in 25 years, which is in October of this year, that all those records are released. And that's what we're pushing for and fighting for. And make sure you keep that in mind with your congressman. Okay? Well, I thank you. And I believe that we have time for questions and answers, and I'm sure there are people who express any disagreement. Fine. Stephen, you'll come back up here and... okay.
Do you believe there was a connection between the murders of JFK and RFK?
In a political, philosophical way, yes. Not not do I believe or could I ever prove the same people, but the same kinds of people, because to look for 8 years of Bobby Kennedy, they would be faced with the same kind. And Bobby Kennedy, I think as a matter of record now, did express to somebody that he was going to reopen. I should say reopen. He's going to look into the. I think his son has said this, that his father, Senator Robert Kennedy, said. And by the way, and I don't want to digress. You'll invite me back another time for this, but I love to do this, and I'm not going to miss the opportunity. So, and if somebody really knows this, keep your mouth shut if you really know it, for sure. But I want to ask you, talking about Senator Robert Kennedy, so you won't think I'm some kind of a conspiratorial nut, but show you how these things can happen in our great country. Sirhan, remember, Bobby Kennedy has just won the California primary. He's going to get the Democratic nomination. That's it. Walking out through the kitchen, they got to avoid the crowd. They'll tear him to shreds with his clothing. They can't waste, so they come on. We'll go out through the kitchen, and there's Sirhan, Palestinian immigrant, and there's the senator walking toward him, and Sirhan shoots. Okay, that's it. You all remember that, older folks and younger. Okay, all right. What was the distance between Sirhan's gun and Robert Kennedy's body when he shot? 2 feet. 6 feet? 3 feet? You're right on target. This is it. This is what everybody says. And I probably now, I don't know, collectively, I don't know, it could be certainly 50 to 100,000 people. I've been doing this for all these years. What if I tell you it's a matter of record? It's there. Go and look up the autopsy report. Dr. Tom Noguchi, an excellent forensic pathologist, close friend and colleague, who did the autopsy. I remember Tom calling me in the middle of the night, not to talk about how to do an autopsy, but how to keep them from spiriting the senator's body away as they had done with John Kennedy here in Dallas. And I remember at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, my wife was in a hospital having given birth to our daughter, and I said, Tom again has forgotten the 3-hour time difference, and he's calling to tell me that Kennedy, senator, has been shot. Okay. So there is the official autopsy report, signed by Dr. Noguchi. The evidence looked at by 5 or 6 board-certified forensic pathologists on his staff. 3 military forensic pathologists. That was my big suggestion to Tom. 2 suggestions. I said, Tom, got to preempt the government. You invite, and we knew these guys, they were our colleagues, they were our contemporaries. Invite them to send forensic pathologists to be there with you when you do the autopsy. And the second thing I recommended was you got to reach out to somebody that's close to the Kennedy family and in government. And I immediately thought of Pierre Salinger, who was a native Californian, and Tom did both of those things, and so on. So, all right, so the 3 military forensic pathologists, and then 2 civilian forensic pathologists who were official consultants, William Eckert, now deceased, and me. All of us, plus some top-level academic pathologists at UCLA. The shot that killed Robert Kennedy, ready for this? Number 1, entered behind his right ear with a forward trajectory, Sirhan shooting in front. And the distance of the shot was 1 to 1.5 inches. I'll repeat that, 1 to 1.5 inches. That is a matter of scientific record corroborated by ballistic studies. So you've got to be asking yourself, what the hell is Weck telling us? How can it be? I'll tell you. How can it be? In the trial, defense attorney, and he was not somebody appointed from the public defender's office, Grant Cooper was his name, an experienced criminal defense attorney, never asked Dr. Noguchi on cross-examination, and obviously on direct prosecution, never got into it. And the defense attorney never consulted a forensic pathologist or a criminalist ballistics expert. The only forensic scientist he used was a psychiatrist to talk about the psychiatric state of Sirhan. Okay? there. So I just mention this to you, not to get into a whole other ball game. But when people say, but geez, that's it. Go and check it out and see. So anybody who says, the government told me, yeah, the government, we're still learning things, aren't we, about World War II, Korean War and Vietnam War. The government told you. And this isn't a Democratic or Republican, liberal, conservative thing. This is the government. This Pollyannish, this incredibly naive belief that our government is great democracy. Sure, I don't want to live anywhere else. I want to live in America. It is a great country. But I mean, to believe that we would never do anything like that. Wake up. It's just not true. It's just not true. There are the facts. I can take other cases too. Elvis Presley, medical examiner announcing that he died of heart disease. He had 12 central nervous system depressant and drugs. It's a matter of record. Check it out. I just throw these in, a little parenthetical comment here, Stephen, so people, maybe wake people up a little bit who still believe simply because it came from the government. And the government never lies to us.
Let me ask another question here. You were friends with Arlen Specter, the architect of the magic bullet theory. Did the two of you ever discuss it?
No. Even though he spoke at our 2003 conference, which still referred to as the Pittsburgh Conference, and we invited him, and like my colleague, Dr. Michael Bodden, my good friend and colleague who chaired the forensic pathology panel, we wanted to reach out to both sides. They had Dr. Grossman come up and so on. We never really got into the discussion. I was tempted, but I think each of us just felt that. I know from one of our fellow critics in Philadelphia, supposedly, who had lunch with Specter not long before he passed away, that he expressed some thoughts, but I wasn't there, so I can't really say for sure. But no, I did not talk about it with Specter.
Okay. I think this is in reference to one of the autopsy photographs you showed. If there was a bullet wound in the rear of the head, shouldn't they have shaved the area around it before they photographed it?
Yes, you always do that. You take your photographs of bullet wounds as they exist, blood and gore and tissue, and then you shave the area. In fact, you collect hair too to look for carbonaceous material. Is going to help you determine distance. In a case like this, that was not a question. No matter what anybody believes, we know that it was fired from a distance beyond a couple of feet, which is then where we go beyond a couple of feet, you don't find stippling or deposition of soot and gunpowder residue. But yes, you take those pictures, absolutely. And you've seen pictures that I showed, I forget in my collection here tonight. They show the president's scalp in the rear completely intact. There's just no way. There's just no way. And again, just go back and this is on paper and this is videoed. These doctors being queried and so on what they saw and where the damage was, and they talk about the posterior cranial fossa region and cerebellum, and yet we have Humes and Boswell and Fink, everything's intact. And by the way, interestingly, Fink shortly after that left America, and nobody can contact him. I've tried. He even was a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences for years with no address, and I tried very hard. I'm a former president of the Academy and so on. Pierre Fink he came back, I think, once to testify back in the late 60s, and that's it. I saw Pierre Fink in 65 when I gave my paper in Chicago at the Drake Hotel. And I remember I mentioned that I had known him, I had met him, and I said, Pierre, I'd like to talk with you a little bit and just ask you some. And he not he wasn't angry at all. He was just so down. He just shook his head. You could see, close to tears. He said, I wish I could talk about this. Because he knew a little bit about forensic pathology.
So one of the autopsy doctors was there when you gave your first paper on the assassination.
Yes.
Okay, now you were talking a little quietly. What was his reaction to your paper?
He was, well, not by my paper, no. He was sickened by the, he couldn't talk about the subject.
Okay, you were asking him about the autopsy.
We sat down at lunch.
Okay.
And no, he couldn't talk. It was just, I can imagine. He was from Switzerland, very straight, kind of a, intellectual, rigid, and he just, I could, and I'm just conjecturing. I want to say this, but I can see, that it was burning up inside of him.
Mm. There are a number of questions in this stack that ask the exact same thing. Basically, what do you think happened? You laid out, as you say, the case for conspiracy, but who was responsible? Who specifically do you
Well,
do you
first
hold
of all,
accountable?
let's talk about this from a pathological, forensic, scientific, investigative standpoint. What do I think happened? I do believe there were shots fired from the rear. And by the way, I want to say this too. I'm not at all concerned in any kind of a personal way about Lee Harvey Oswald. My input, and I don't speak for any of my colleagues, they can speak for themselves, has nothing to do with a retroactive, posthumous exculpation, exoneration of Lee Harvey Oswald. That's a whole other ballgame. I personally, I don't believe Oswald was a shooter. We can talk about that too. There's a lot on that. I forgot to mention about Oswald, and maybe we'll come back to that in a moment. But let me finish up with this. But there were shots fired from the rear. But there definitely was a shot fired from the right front side, and it had to be from behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. And that's the shot that comes in, produces all this damage, causes blood and brain tissue to go backward toward the left, and so on. And that was the fatal shot. That's what I believe. All right, now what do I believe? Who was behind it?
How many shots total?
I think there were 4 shots, possibly 5, but I think there were definitely 4 shots.
Okay.
Who do I believe? I'll tell you what I believe. And this, of course, I can't prove. But you got to think about it. Who? I've given you the background, politically, what was happening in this country, and indeed in the world, and where we stood. And John Kennedy, no question about his re-election. You remember what happened. Lyndon Johnson murdered Barry Goldwater. What do you think would have happened with Kennedy? And Bobby Kennedy, I don't think there's any question. If you talk to a political expert, again, whether you're a Democrat, I'm not saying this as a Democrat or what I would have liked to have seen, any political analyst will tell you there's no question Bobby Kennedy would have won that election. Remember that Hubert Humphrey lost by a fraction of 1% because the liberals were unhappy that he, as vice president, had not come out and criticized the Vietnam War, so they abandoned him. Okay, so I want to show you that Bobby Kennedy was going to be. So who do I think? I think that these were some people who could not sit by. They saw America going to hell in a basket. They could not see America pursuing these policies and looking at 13 more years of the Kennedys, of what was going to happen, pulling out of Vietnam, making détente with Russia, forgetting about the Cuban situation or cooling it down and from the heated position that it was. So who does that leave you? It got to leave you people in a powerful position. And I believe it was one, I think, and I wish, and I don't know this, I would be willing to bet insofar as determining that the assassination will take place, I would be willing to bet there weren't more than 4 or 5 people who made that decision. Oh, sure, everybody, then, you do this and you do this and so on. You may come to guess while you're being assigned this duty. But and I believe some probably ex-CIA and military people. Who was the lead man on the Warren Commission who attended most of the meetings, probably exceeding maybe collectively the others combined the time that they spent? Is this ironic? If you wrote this in a novel, somebody wouldn't believe it. They get Allen Dulles, who had been removed by Kennedy as the head of the CIA. He now comes back and he's the lead man on the Warren Commission. Warren, you're Chief Justice, you got a few things to deal with. 2 U.S. senators, 2 congressmen, you got some things to deal with in your life. Dulles is running the damn show. It's unbelievable. That's who I believe. And I think very likely that Dulles definitely was one of the people involved. I absolutely believe. And not all by himself, but I do believe that Dulles. Beyond that, you got people out there. You had your General Walker down here. There was that Admiral Crommelin. They were all in favor of bombing Moscow after World War II. Remember that? People don't know that. When World War II ended, what these ultra right-wingers wanted to do, they wanted to go in and nuclear and nuke Russia. Get those communists. People don't know or forget this. That's what was going on in America, leading to McCarthyism and so on. That was the milieu. That was the socio-political milieu. How do you deal with this? How do you deal with this? You can't. Hoover tried to do something with Martin Luther King, destroy him. He'll release information about King's sexual dalliances and so on. And these people had a following. And again, I'm not promoting that political philosophy. Set that aside. I'm just talking reality. Reality. Whatever John Kennedy said, 100 million Americans, they fell in line. Martin Luther King just fell in line. Slavishly, dedicatedly, whatever it was, they fell in line. How do you deal with that? There is no way to deal with it. People say, how come Clinton wasn't shot? How come Bush wasn't shot? How come somebody hasn't shot Trump? You know why? Because you can deal with them. And you deal. They win election, they lose election. Trump won the election, Trump will lose the election. You don't have to worry. You couldn't do that with the Kennedys. There's no way you're going to beat them. How long do you let that go by when you see your country going to hell? That's what was at stake for these people. They were super patriots. When they saw the flag flying and they heard the Star-Spangled Banner being sung, they saw and heard something more than regular folks, regular U.S. citizens and patriots like us are incapable of envisioning. We just don't have that kind of deep-seated dedication. And I know people say, well, how, you cannot compare yourself. These people that become involved as spooks of the CIA, you can't compare yourself. How can somebody, here's another question, how does somebody keep a secret like this and so on? People keep secrets. They do it. They're capable of doing it. I can't do it. You can't do it. Some people keep a secret better than others and so on. But I'm just saying, you got to understand that the kinds of people you were dealing with. And then the years go by. Lyndon Johnson never bought the Warren Commission. Senator Richard Russell and Hale Boggs from Louisiana, good old Southern boys, they knew it was bull. They knew that. They just signed on. Get the things done. Johnson, the guy that win the election. Sign on, man. Get it rid of. Russell and Boggs never bought the Warren Commission. And Johnson did not either. Good old Southern boys, they knew what the hell was going on.
All right. So to follow up with the who was Jack Ruby, so what?
Mafia.
Okay,
the mafia. Some people will say the mafia took out Kennedy. Oh, the mafia definitely was in play here. Oh, it absolutely had some things to be done. Tidy up, do this and do that, absolutely. And that's where these people got in touch with the mafia. Whether it was Sam Giancana and Marcello, Carlos Marcello. I mean, you're talking about, Of course, they were involved in taking care of some of these things. You remember what was going on with Carlos Marcello and Bobby Kennedy, and that whole scene. There's no question. And by the way, too, for those people who still remember as a little kid, everybody talked about the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. This is the J. Edgar Hoover who insisted there was no such thing as the mafia. You know, I mean, there was no mafia. There was no mafia. This is the same J. Edgar Hoover that insisted that all his people be square and so on. Okay. He could party in a dress with his Clyde Tolan, but his FBI agents had to be straight. I want to, I just want to share all these sides. Just keep them in mind. Are they related? Well, part of America. Again, I know I'm repeating, but I just want to make this clear. There are amongst you here, and people who believe in the Warren Commission, I just want you to understand, you can't have any ands, ifs, maybes, buts, hollovers, moreovers. You can't have that. You're pregnant or you're not pregnant. There's no in between. If you believe the Warren Commission report, I just want you to know this. I want you to know this. What you are believing, what you are accepting is that nobody, from the beginning through the execution of the act to the end, nobody had any knowledge, any awareness, any complicity, any involvement. 0, 0, 0. That's what you are buying with the Warren Commission. I want you to understand that. You're buying Humes and Boswell. You're buying the single bullet theory. You're buying the whole thing. Just look at the whole scenario. Just look at it, the whole thing. Who was Lee Harvey Oswald? And then he's down there, one floor below us, and the cars are coming right at him on Houston, right? Mm-hmm. And closer and closer. I've got my gun. There's Grodin. There's Kennedy. Closer. Man, I got a hell of. I want to wait till you turn. You're going away from me downhill. There's some tree branches. That's when I'll shoot. And then what the hell? I gotta give the cops a break here too. Here's the gun. I'll just throw it in here, okay, into the corner. And then he is down there drinking his Coke on the second floor. He's gone from the southeast corner to the northwest corner. A cop ran in. What was that cop's name? Whatever the cop's name was.
Marion Baker.
Marion Baker, okay. And then he say, there's Oswald drinking a Coke, right? Boy, is some cool, calm SOB, man, huh? I mean, you just killed the president. Not to mention that you're this fanatic, killed the president, but you keep insisting that you don't know what the hell they're talking about. You didn't kill anybody. And where was this fanaticism from? Why was he? I have it from first-hand sources that he liked Kennedy very much. Where did this hatred come from? What is his background politically? To kill Kennedy? Where did it come from? And where was he going then? To the movie theater? Just think about it. It's incredibly bizarre. But this is what you got to buy. You want to make sure that you know what you are buying. I'm not here to convert anybody, but as anybody that walks out of here still believing in the Warren Commission, okay, then I got a structure in Brooklyn. I'm available for sale.
Well, I think regardless of what anyone in this room believes, what the passion you have demonstrated tonight reminds all of us, and I hope I speak for everyone here, that this story matters.
It really does matter. It really does matter. Thank you for listening to episode 91 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.